Welcome to the second in a series of podcasts from the Mary Rose Museum while it's shut under COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. Only this time we're going to be doing it on video. My name is Adrian Bowles and I've worked on many projects for the Mary Rose Museum over the last 25 years or so. Today I'm going to be talking to Professor Eleanor Schofield, who is responsible for the ongoing conservation of the ship and all the objects in the museum. This conservation began in 1982 when the ship was famously raised from the seabed. From then until the present day, the ship has lain in the same dry dock here at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, still in fact on the same cradle which was used to lift her all those years ago. She was first sprayed with water, then with chemicals, and then finally air dried. For 34 years she underwent this extensive conservation programme, and in 2016 this museum, built around that dry dock and the ship itself, was finally finished, and visitors could at last see the Mary Rose on open view, no plastic or glass windows to look through. She's now contained in what is effectively a very large, environmentally controlled showcase, possibly the biggest in the world. And as I said, the person who's in charge of making sure the temperature and the humidity are all at optimum levels for preserving the ship and all the objects on display is Professor Eleanor Schofield. Eleanor has worked here since 2012 and, picking up on the work of her predecessors, has spent literally days and nights researching, testing, experimenting and defining groundbreaking scientific techniques to make sure the ship and all those objects are cared for in the best possible way. And today we're going to find out how she does that and why it's so important to keep doing it while the museum is closed. Hi Eleanor, great to see you.
Hi, you too.
So here we are, the museum's shut, but obviously your work has had to carry on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the museum's closed, but everything to do with caring for the collection continues. We can't, when you see around us here, everywhere where we have an artefact, the air that artefact is in is controlled. So it has a controlled humidity and a controlled temperature. And to create that takes a lot of equipment that you can't just turn off. Actually, some of it relies on chillers which have cold water in, and there's pipes all around this building, and if we turned it all off it would just remain stagnant, and there's all kinds of issues with that which I won't go into, and we don't want to go down that road. So it means that everything still needs to keep going, and also we need to keep checking on all of the collections. So we have this building here, the museum, but we also occupy a few other locations on the dockyard that all have some form of collection in, whether it's a store or whether it's a workroom or something like that. So we have to go and check on them, check all of those are working. We have artefacts that are in tanks, and over time the solution in the tank will evaporate off, so we have to keep filling those up. And when you're talking about tanks that have like 20,000 litres of water in, you can imagine that takes quite a long time to do. So I'm the only person. We have two maintainers who are working in the museum on all the equipment here, but then I'm the only person who hasn't been furloughed on the conservation and collection side. So there's a lot to do to try and pick up all of that, and it's all things that I'm familiar with, but they're not. It's not my job. I'm not a conservator. I'm not a collections assistant, so they're not the things that are totally intuitive to me. So I'm trying to like piece it all together. So it's very busy, and then all of my normal job, most of that has kind of continued too. So it's quite hectic at the moment.
So obviously, you could argue the most important object in the museum is the ship. There are plenty of others, obviously, but it's a vital draw on the visitors, obviously, to see the ship. What happens if you turn off the environmental controls? What would happen to the wood of the ship?
So the thing with the wood and with all the collection, almost the most important thing is for it to be a stable environment. So there are set temperatures and humidity where it's the best that it can be, but almost the worst thing it can be is that it really fluctuates, which of course the natural ambient temperature, if you go out in the morning and then the middle of the day, it feels quite different. And that's the worst thing, because essentially what happens is the material will take on water that's in the air and then let it go again, and then take it on again, and it kind of can stress the material. So physically, what could happen with something like the ship is you would get you'd get actually both physical and chemical changes potentially. So the wood could start to dry out, move away from its kind of like natural resting point, because there is, whilst it is predominantly dry, there is some moisture in there. If that all came out, you could get some shrinkage, it could start cracking. Worse than that, if things start to change in terms of their dimensions, it could then start to move because it's not quite pieced together properly anymore. And then if things start to move, obviously that creates huge problems for me. But then there's differences that you can't see with the naked eye immediately, because the wood and the rest of our collection, a lot of the problems that I have to deal with are because of things that are in the artefacts that shouldn't be there, and that's because of hundreds of years being buried in the sea. So there's all kinds of elements in seawater that get into them, and they shouldn't be there, and over time they can cause problems. So particularly with the ship, you have things in there that then when you expose it to the air, they can change and potentially form acids which can degrade the wood. So there's a whole range of things that can happen if we don't have that stable environment.
And what about some of the objects that aren't wood? I mean, there's leather, there's iron, all sorts of metals. Presumably you have to treat those in different ways, do you?
Yeah. So with the wood, some of the treatment that we did, you'll remember that we used to spray the ship. That was because the wood, whilst it's in fantastic condition, considering kind of everything it's been through, some of it had degraded. So we treated it with something called polyethylene glycol to compensate for that lost wood. In other materials, say for example the cannonballs, you have chlorine that's got into them, and this is from the salt in seawater. And that can cause a lot of problems because there's a corrosion product that forms with the chlorine in it, which is very, very damaging. It essentially, the corrosion when it forms takes up a bigger volume than the original metal, so it just breaks out of it. It gets so much pressure builds up that then it'll just fracture.
Well, a bit like ice being bigger than water when it's frozen.
Yeah. So it just gets bigger and bigger, and then cause that's often what you'll see with the cannonballs, that the ones that have sadly become damaged, is that bits just fragment off because you've got natural cracks in it, and the chlorine has got into there, and then moisture's got into there, and then air gets into there, and then all those things together, it starts to form this corrosion, and then it just will start to crack on the surface. So for those, actually the best thing to try and do is to try and get rid of the chlorine, so we do soaking treatments on those. And then one of the things I've been looking at more recently is some of our bricks, because which actually is interesting talking about the bricks, because it's not something that people will often think about being in this collection, and we've got thousands of them from the galley and from ballast. And they are, they went through a kind of a wash as well. Everything in the collection went through a kind of basic cascade wash to get rid of the salt and also just debris from the sea and everything like that.
Is that wash just clean water?
Yeah.
Or it's no chemicals involved?
No.
Right.
Ideally you would do it with a pure water, so you're not getting any of the normal elements that would be in tap water, which are completely harmless, but you just don't want to introduce more stuff into the item. So the bricks, recently I've started doing some research on those, because you find that again, it's similar elements that you get problems with in the wood and forming acids, but with these as well, they form crystals, and when it gets humid, they essentially go into a liquid again, and then they recrystallize, and each time that happens the crystal gets bigger, and then it just breaks the brick. So it can be really, really damaging. So again, it's one of those things where there's a physical impact and also a chemical impact where it can kind of degrade the material. And that's quite common throughout the collection, really, that it can be those two things, which are connected as well a lot of the time. Because if something starts to disintegrate in acid, then it loses its structural stability, basically, and then you'll start to see those physical properties getting damaged or altered.
And is that's true for soft materials as well, like leather and cloth?
They suffer from bits of the material being lost. You do find actually with things like that the cascade washing worked better, because obviously they're not as thick, so it was easier to try and get things out of them. So they usually are in pretty good condition. And I know that with some of the leather, where you could see bits of iron, because it looks very orangey, it's quite easy to see, treatments were done with a chemical that could basically scavenge that iron off. And when you've got an object like that, when it's nice and flat, it's relatively easy to do that. When you've got a ship like that, and you've got iron that's kind of percolated all the way through it, nearly impossible to do.
Right, so let's just pick up a little bit on the science of conservation then, because this museum over the years has been responsible for developing some techniques. How do you actually go about developing techniques for conservation and restoration? And indeed, actually, just before we go any further, what's the difference between conservation and restoration?
Okay, so conservation, the best way to think of it is that you're trying to do as little as possible to stabilise the material set, and also you're not kind of substituting anything new in. So everything that you see, say for example with the ship, that's all original Mary Rose material. The only thing that isn't is the polyethylene glycol that we've put in to stabilise it, and we've only put enough in to give it that stability and not any more. When you talk about restoration, it would be, say, something like Victory next door to us, where some of the timbers are not the original timbers, and obviously it's completely understandable for them because they're exposed to the elements outside and there's no way it would survive otherwise. So that's the kind of broadly the difference, that you're not adding anything new when you're trying to do as little as possible to keep it authentic.
Yeah, less intervention basically.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so going back now then to the science, how do you go about developing new scientific techniques? What makes you say, oh, well, if we use that chemical, this will work, and so on?
It all starts with what the material needs. And understanding what's happened to it, which actually is why I'm quite suited to this job, because my background is in material science, which is all about understanding what a material is made of, how it may have changed, and then the impact of those changes on the properties that it has. So it starts with understanding what we have. You know, for example, so the ship is made of wood, but what type of wood is it, and how is it degraded? And then you can start to think, right, well, what would be something suitable to go in and treat it? So something like, there are various different treatments that are used for wood. PEG, polyethylene glycol, is probably the most common, and there's loads of different reasons it's chosen, because it's relatively, it's used in a lot of stuff actually. It's like it's a filler used for like toothpaste and all that kind of stuff, so it's not very harmful. It's, in the great scheme of things, it's not that expensive, and it was quite easy to handle, so all these kind of fed into it. In terms of the kind of developing new materials and developing new techniques, it's all about the collaborations and learning from other people, and the scientists that I work with in other institutes. You'll talk to them about maybe some of the issues that you're having, and collectively you'll think, oh well, maybe if we use this technique, that might be able to answer that question. And this is just how it evolves. And then you think, a lot of the time for me, I'll think, right, well, I've done this technique on the wood and it's told me that. Is there a way that I could apply that to a different material? Would that help? Is it gonna tell me something? And so it all comes back to then how we're going to look after the collection.
So that's great. So you've done the science and you start to conserve all the objects. As you talked about, there's environmental controls in the museum itself and in the showcases. What controls those environmental controls, both individually and for the main ship itself? So
it varies between the different systems. So if I start with the ship hull, so all of the air around the ship is controlled. In a sense, that's the showcase. That has, below us in the dock, there are 3 air handling units which create that environment, and they feed in through ducts into the ship hull. The gallery opposite the ship, it's on 3 levels, but it is actually one volume, and that again has units which are in another plant room, which then feed in. And then the individual showcases all have their own control unit underneath, so they have then, and in all places you have the ability to heat or cool or dehumidify or humidify. So they can do a lot of things, and it's all about just trying to keep it as stable as possible.
And presumably, therefore, in those showcases, they all have to have similar types or similar materials in them, because one material will want more temperature and more humidity than another. Is that the case?
Well, in an ideal world, you would. Interestingly, in our old museum, we did have materials separated. So we would separate the organics, so the wood, the leather, things like that, from the inorganics, so all the metals and things like that. In this museum, we haven't done that, partly because it's quite difficult to then tell the story. So when you have a particular theme, say a character case, and it's all their things, they didn't have, say, only organic items, and particularly the gallery that's across from the ship, which is kind of the mirror image and has the items where they were found, it would be impossible to do that. So what we've done here is we've gone for the conditions that you would typically use for organics, and the reason for that is that they are the most kind of they're more likely to degrade, so that a lot of the metals are more stable. So, and this still gives those metals a kind of stable environment to be in.
And how is that monitored? Is there presumably there are monitoring devices in all of the showcases?
Oh, yes.
And in the ship hall?
Yeah, all over the ship. So when you walk around the museum, you'll see in each of the showcases that there are these small white monitors, and also they're dotted all around the ship as well. And what these do is they feed into a system and they record the temperature and the humidity every kind of 5-10 minutes. So we can, at any time, we can look at that and see what's happening in that showcase. And also we can look retrospectively as well, so we have the whole data since day one, which is really, really useful. And also what we can do with these is that you can set an alarm on them. So for example, I had just last week that an alarm on one of the monitors in the ship hole went, and then it pings me an email, so then I know to go and look and see if the system is running as it should do. And it had very slightly gone out, but it's a really handy system where I can then think, right, well, has that got, so I can go and look at the data. Sometimes you can see that it's just like spiked and come back, and it's just one of those things. Or I might see that for that, since the morning, it might have started going up. Or for example, sometimes our maintenance team, the bits of kit, they'll need work on them, so they'll give me a call and say, look, it's likely you're going to get alarms today because we need to just turn it off slightly and then get it back online again. So yeah, there is a lot of kit and stuff behind the scenes that's all linked together, and yeah, I'm just still, actually years down the line, we're kind of getting to grips with all the different things that you can do and all the information that you can get from that data retrospectively. In fact, one of the things that we've been looking at a lot now is trying to look at how energy efficient a lot of the kit is, and that's where all this data that we've got on all the different parameters is really handy, because you can then tie it to what were the settings on the kit, what did that mean for the showcases, how does that correlate to the outside weather conditions, the conditions in here, the number of visitors, all this kind of stuff, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, well, no, but it's important, isn't it? And have you had, through that monitoring, have you had any scary moments over the years? Has there been a moment in time where you think, oh Christ, there is actually something wrong here?
Not so much scary, things that were quite frustrating, I would say, particularly because we opened the museum in 2013, and then it wasn't as it is now, so we had windows looking into the ship hall because we were still going through quite an active phase of conservation. And then when we opened the ship hall up, that changed the volume around the ship, so it changed a lot of we basically changed what we were asking the kit to do. So there was quite a lot of figuring out the different settings then, and what we were finding, because you have the top gallery where you're in the same enclosure as the ship, that the airlock doors weren't quite working as they should, so you could see the conditions at the ship hall, that they just would, at about 10 o'clock, just around when we opened, the humidity would start to come up and then it would go down again, and it wasn't a huge amount, but it was really annoying for a while because we couldn't quite figure out what it was doing, and then we have now, so it's nice and stable again. So there's things like that.
So do visitors make a difference? Do we give off humidity and heat? And things have to adjust for the number of visitors? And
yeah, so that's why we have this system. In fact, interestingly, we learnt quite a few lessons from Vassar in Stockholm. They had noticed that they were getting these salts forming on the wood, and they realised it was from humidity. So, if you've got a whole load, say it's tipping it down outside, and you've got a whole group of people coming in with their wet bags and coats and that, and then walk in, that moisture just goes into the air. And you can't see that, but it's everywhere around it, and all these materials will just like soak it up. So they realised that, and then they built a really good air conditioning system for the entire building. So we based a lot of what we did on that, because we saw some of the problems that they'd had. So that's why there's lots of little things in the museum actually that when you first walk in and there's galleries you go through where it's not quite an airlock, but it's two sets of doors, and we show a film there, and it helps with visitor flow and lots of different things, but it also does buffer a bit as well, people coming in. It's not just this whoosh of air straight from outside. It's like kind of slows it down a bit. And then when you go into the ship hall, you go through one door and the next door won't open until the other one's shut, and that just kind of tempers it all, so you're not bringing in loads of moisture.
Yeah, absolutely. So throughout all the years that you've been doing this and developing techniques and so on, is there one piece of research or one particular scientific technique that you think, yeah, that's it, I'm really pleased with that?
I think one of the things that I really enjoy doing is some of the experiments we do where we use something called a synchrotron. And this is my background, basically. That's how I started off in research science. It's basically a very, very bright X-ray source, and you can do lots of different techniques with it. You can, say, use X-rays to understand what something is made of, so get like chemical composition, but you can also do imaging and stuff like that. So we've done some research on some of the cannonballs, some of the corrosion that I was talking about. So we've taken a piece of the cannonball and put it into the beamline, and it basically then you can rotate it, you can slice through it, so you can look from the surface of the sample, you can then look where the cracks are, where the metal is, where the corrosion is. You can then start to do all kinds of clever stuff with correlating those, like are the spots of corrosion always near the surface? Are they near cracks? Are they not? And it's so I love stuff like that. And we've been able to do similar with the wood as well, where you image what's there, and then you can, if you have the right standards for what you think might be inside the wood, you can then kind of do a kind of fingerprint analysis, basically. So then you can not only know what's there, but where it is, because that's the thing that can be really important. Because if I want to develop a treatment, say for the wood, it's, if you do a bit of analysis on a bit of wood that's this big and it tells you that, there's, X compound in there, if I don't know where it is, how can I tailor a technique that's designed to go in and get it and take it out again? So those kind of techniques where you can combine it together are really, really clever and exciting.
It sounds very clever, really. It really does. So similar question then, over the years that you've been here, have you developed a particular fondness for any particular object? Is there one object that you look at that's maybe something that you think of as a scientist that appeals to you, or can you view them as a member of the general public and think, I really like those peppercorns, or whatever it might be?
I think I'm going to cheat and answer it in two ways, because there is the way that I look at it as a material scientist, as the kind of person responsible for caring for the collection. And I think in that sense, purely because of the amount of work I've had to do on it, it would be the ship. When I first started working here, it was a year before we started drying the ship. So I was put solely on getting it ready for that. And that was everything from physically preparing the ship, washing it down, all that kind of real hands-on stuff, to developing programs of work where we would look at how things change in the wood using a synchrotron. There's actually one just up the road in Oxfordshire called Diamond Light Source, so we've done a whole load of work with them. So it's been just such a range of different things. I mean, even to this day, one day we'll be taking samples that we'll go and do these kind of sophisticated techniques on, and then in the last year I've been on the ship with a backpack hoovering it. So it's kind of like and everything in between. So from a kind of work perspective, I think the ship definitely holds a special place in my heart. From looking at it as a collection, the things that I really, really like are the kind of everyday objects and the things that remind you that there was people on board this was a living, breathing ship, with all the things they needed. So things like the knit combs and stuff like that. And there's also a beautiful little wooden spoon that I quite like as well. And I almost like it so much for its simplicity. It's just lovely. And then when you think about with these things, the tools that they would have had available to them to make them, especially say with the knit combs, and you look at how precise they are, it blows my mind.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, there are some amazing objects in here. Is it something like 19,000? We've
got over 19,000 in the collection. There's about 5,000 on display here, which actually gives you an idea of how many artefacts 19,000 is. I mean, we have a cellar just across the way where we have timber stored, and we have just over 4,000 timbers. And they are a mixture of barrel staves and logs and quite a lot of the timbers from the port side, so we never had all of that, but we do have some bits. And also, actually, interestingly, some of the cabins and partition ways and stuff like that. So one of the dreams long term is that we'll be able to conserve them and reunite them with the ship and keep telling more of the story.
That would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks, Eleanor. Yes, those personal objects are amazing, aren't they? And as you say, this is the only place in the country, actually in the world, where you can come and see this many real Tudor objects. They are all real. All the objects on display in this museum are the real thing.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely fantastic and completely unique. It's brilliant. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for sitting in talking with us. It's been really terrific.
Thanks.
Very, very interesting as always.